Grayson Parker drummed his fingers on the steering wheel as he drove through the streets of his suburban neighborhood. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the neatly manicured lawns. He felt a sense of contentment. Another day at the office done, another evening to spend with his family. He pulled into the driveway and into the garage. He pulled into the driveway and saw that the garage door was open. He smiled when he saw his daughter's bike propped against the wall. She'd been begging him to take the training wheels off and insisting she was ready. Maybe this weekend. He thought the house was quiet as he stepped inside. The aroma of dinner lingered in the air. He called out, "I'm home." He called out, shrugging off his jacket and loosening his tie. Kayla appeared in the doorway to the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Hey honey, how was work?" At the mention of his brother, Grayson felt a brief tension, but he pushed it aside. Things had been strained lately, but family was family. Great, I'll go say hi to Maya before dinner, he thought, as he climbed the stairs. Grayson's mind drifted to the growing distance he felt. He dealt with Kayla. They'd been arguing. They were snapping at each other over little things, but every marriage had its rough patches, right? WA thought this one would be fine, but it wasn't. He paused outside Maya's door, hearing her voice from within. He was about to knock when he heard another voice respond. It was unmistakably his brother's dad. "When will we live like a real family?" Maya asked. Her tone was plaintive. Grayson's hand hovered inches from the door, his breath catching in his throat. Asher replied in a low, soothing voice. "Sue Maya, we just need to finish our plan and take the house from him so we can have a place to live." The world felt like it was tilting on its axis. Grayson stumbled back, his legs nearly giving out beneath him. His mind reeled, struggling to process what he had just heard. Grayson was taken aback to hear that Kayla and Asher were planning to take everything from him and Maya. He made his way down the hallway, barely making it to the bathroom before his stomach started to churn. Grayson grabbed the edge of the sink and stared at his reflection in the mirror, wondering how long this had been going on and how he could have been so blind. A soft knock on the door made him jump. "Gray, you okay in there?" Kayla's voice was filled with false concern. Grayson's jaw clenched with rage and pain. He took a deep breath and forced his voice to remain steady. "Yeah, something didn't agree with me at lunch. I'll be down in a minute. Dinner's almost ready." He listened. He could hear her footsteps retreating, then splashed cold water on his face as the shock began to subside. A cold determination settled over him. He decided he wouldn't confront them just yet. The next morning, Grayson kissed Kayla goodbye as if nothing had changed. He drove to work, but instead of heading to his office, he found himself outside a plain building with tinted windows. The sign read Hawkeye Investigations. Inside, a grizzled man with steely eyes introduced himself as Frank Donovan. Grayson laid out what he'd overheard, watching the detective's expression grow grim. "I need concrete evidence," Grayson said. "Bank records, photos, anything that." Frank nodded slowly. "It won't be cheap and it won't be pretty. Are you sure you want to go down this road?" "I need to know everything over the next few weeks," Grayson replied, meeting Frank's gaze unflinchingly. He spent the next few weeks going over the reports Frank had given him. The truth was even worse than he'd imagined. Bank statements showed large sums of money being funneled into offshore accounts. There were photos, dozens of them, of Kayla and Asher in intimate embraces. Grayson's hands shook as he read through transcripts of their phone conversations. It showed how they planned to take his assets through a series of dodgy legal moves. But the final blow came in a plain manila envelope. Grayson stared at the DNA test results, his world crashing down around him. Maya and Finn, they weren't his kids, they were Asher's. That night, as Grayson lay awake beside his sleeping wife, something inside him, the pain and betrayal hardened into a cold, implacable rage. They had taken everything from him, his trust, his family, his very identity as a father. Now he would take everything from them. The next morning, Grayson called in sick to work and drove to meet with Caroline Reeves, the shark of a lawyer Frank had recommended. Her office gave off a sense of wealth and power, with its sleek lines and gleaming surfaces. Caroline listened impassively as Grayson laid out the situation, her manicured nails tapping against the polished desk. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair, a predator's gleam in her eye. "Mr. Parker, what exactly is it you want?" Grayson's voice was at ice. "I want to destroy them completely and utterly. I want them to lose everything, their freedom, their reputation, their future. I want them to suffer for the rest of their miserable lives." A slow smile spread across Caroline's face. "Then let's get to work over the following months." Grayson threw himself into his plan with single-minded focus. By day, he was focused and professional, but at night, he was a different person. Hunched over his laptop in the home office, he worked with Caroline's guidance and a team of expert hackers to create a digital trail that implicated Kayla and Asher in crimes far beyond their initial scheme. Bank accounts were created and backdated, showing years of suspicious transactions. Emails were fabricated, linking them to known criminal enterprises and offshore shell companies that all led back to Kayla and Asher. Everything started to come together. Grayson started sharing some information with the police. Some anonymous tips suggested there was a big money laundering operation going on. The IRS was also hearing about tax evasion and fraud. Meanwhile, Kayla and Asher were still completely unaware of what was going on. Grayson watched with a kind of grim satisfaction as they became bolder and more confident that they were going to win. One evening, as they were all sitting around the dinner table, Asher cleared his throat. "There's something Kayla and I need to talk to you about," he said. Grayson looked up from his food. A mask of innocence. "What's up, KLA?" Reached out, patting his hand. "It's about the house, honey. We've been thinking with the market the way it is. Maybe it would be smart to transfer the deed, for tax purposes. We could put it in Asher's name. I've got some connections. That could really help us make the most of the situation." Grayson fought to keep the bitterness from his voice. "That's a big step," he said. "I'll have to think about it." "Of course," Kayla said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Take all the time you need," she told him. Later that night, Grayson sat in his car outside a CD store. He was shaking as he dialed Frank's number. "It's time," he said. When the detective answered, he told him to make the call the next morning. When Grayson Rose got up that morning, it was gray and drizzly. He was dressed in his best suit, and he was buttering toast when the front door started pounding. "FBI, open up!" Kayla came flying down the stairs, her face pale with panic. "What's going on, Grayson?" He just shook his head, looking confused and concerned, as he opened the door. "Money laundering, tax evasion, and fraud." Kayla was screaming in disbelief as she was handcuffed. Asher burst in moments later, only to be tackled to the ground. Grayson stood in the midst of the chaos, watching as his wife and brother were led away in handcuffs. He was filled with confusion and betrayal in that moment. A flicker of doubt passed through him. Was this really justice, or had he become just as monstrous as they were? But then he remembered the overheard conversation, the photos and the DNA tests that had shattered his world and his resolve. Grayson was hardened once more. This was only the beginning of their suffering as the police car pulled away. He turned to find Maya and Finn huddled on the stairs, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. Maya's voice trembled as she asked, "What's going on? Where are they taking Mom and Asher?" At the children, the living proof of Kayla and Asher's betrayal in that moment, any affection he might have felt for them vanished. These weren't his kids, they were just pawns in a game that had nearly destroyed him. "Pack your bags," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "I can't stay here anymore." Finn began to cry, but Grayson felt nothing. He turned away, already planning his next move. The house was quiet and empty of the family he'd once cherished, but Grayson felt only a grim satisfaction. They had tried to take everything from him, and now he would make sure they paid. They lost it all. The harsh fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead as Grayson sat across from Detective Simmons. His face was a mask of concern and bewilderment. "Mr. Parker," Simmons began, his voice gruff but not unkind. "I know this must be a shock to you. Your wife and brother are Facing some pretty serious charges, Grayson leaned forward, his eyes wide with feigned innocence. I still can't believe it. There must be some mistake. Simmons shook his head and slid a folder across the table. I'm afraid the evidence is quite damning. We've uncovered a complex web of financial fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. It goes back years. Grayson's voice cracked convincingly. How could I not have known? The detective's expression often seemed slightly. Those closest to us are often the best at hiding their true nature. We'll need to go through your finances with a fine-toothed comb. Toth, make sure you weren't involved. Grayson nodded eagerly. Of course, anything you need. I want to get to the bottom of this as much as you do. He left the station. Grayson allowed himself a small grim smile. Phase 1 was complete. Now it was time to turn the screws. The next few weeks passed in a blur of. Grayson spent his days helping the authorities. He played the part of a shocked and betrayed husband perfectly. But in the dim light of his home office, his colleagues were busy with something else. Grayson sat hunched over his computer, fingers flying across the keyboard. He was deep in thought. In the darkest corners of the internet, using skills he'd picked up from the hackers Caroline had introduced him to, a knock at the door startled him. He called, quickly minimizing his screens, and said, "Come in." She poked her head in, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. "Dad, can we talk?" He felt a flicker of annoyance. He'd been avoiding the kids as much as possible, unsure how to deal with the living reminders of Kayla and Asher's betrayal. "I don't understand what's happening. Why won't you let us see Mom or Uncle Asher for a moment?" Grayson was tempted to tell her everything. He could see the truth shattering her world, just as his had been destroyed. But that would get in the way of his plans. He needed to maintain the facade for a little longer. "Maya, your mother and uncle have done some very bad things. The police need to sort it all out until then. We have to let the system do its thing." "But they wouldn't do that," Maya protested, tears welling up in her eyes. "There has to be an explanation." Grayson's jaw clenched. "Go to bed, Maya. We're not discussing this anymore." As the door closed behind her, Grayson turned back to his computer. He couldn't afford to let sentimentality get in the way of the plan. There was still a lot of work to be done over the next few months. Grayson's plan was unfolding with great precision. He worked closely with Caroline, using her connections to feed carefully crafted pieces of evidence to the authorities. "We need to be careful," Caroline warned during one of their late-night strategy sessions. If we push too hard too fast, it might raise suspicions." Grayson nodded, his eyes cold. "I understand, but I want them buried so deep they'll never see the light of day again." Caroline studied him for a moment, a mix of admiration and weariness in her eyes. "You're sure about this? Once we start down this road, there's no going back." "Going back? I've never been more sure of anything in my life," Grayson replied without hesitation as the case against Kayla and Asher built. He continued to play his part flawlessly, visiting them in jail. His face showed confused hurt and betrayal. "How could you do this?" he demanded of Kayla, separated by a thick pane of glass to me, to our families. Kaya's eyes were red and puffy, her usually immaculate appearance disheveled. "Please, you have to believe me. We never meant for it to get this far. It was just supposed to be a simple plan to steal everything from. You're trying to destroy our marriage and our families." "No," Kayla cried, pressing her hand against the glass. "It wasn't like that. We were going to tell you to explain." "Save it for the judge." Grayson cut her off. "I'm done listening to your lies," he said, walking away and ignoring her desperate pleas. He felt a surge of dark satisfaction. Let her suffer, let her feel even a fraction of the pain she caused him. His visit to Asher was equally tense. His brother sat across from him, defeat written across his features. "I'm sorry, Gray," Asher began. "We never meant for things to get so out of hand." Grayson leaned forward. Grayson's eyes were fixed on Asher's, and he asked, "How long have you been sleeping with my wife and raising my children as your own?" Asher was taken aback. "It just happened," he replied. "We fell in love, and then you decided to take everything from me." Grayson finished, his tone icy. My home, my family. Was any of it real, or was I just a fool you were using all along? It wasn't like that, Asher protested weakly. We care about you, Gray. We just wanted to help. Asher, you're going to need it to explain yourself to the judge. As he left the prison, Grayson's resolve hardened. Even more, seeing them and hearing their pathetic attempts at justification only fueled his desire for revenge back at home. Grayson redoubled his efforts, spending hours each night fabricating more evidence and creating an intricate web of deceit that would ensnare Kayla and Asher completely. One evening, as he was deep in concentration, a small voice interrupted him. Dad, Grayson looked up to see Finn standing in the doorway clutching a stuffed animal. The sight of the boy, Asher's son, sent a jolt of pain through him. What is it, Finn? He asked, struggling to keep the irritation out of his voice. I had a bad dream, Finn mumbled. His lower lip trembling, Finn asked, Can I sleep with you tonight for a moment? Grayson was tempted to soften and offer comfort to the child he'd once thought was his own. However, the memory of Caleb and Asher's betrayal made him think twice. He told Finn firmly, You're too old for this nonsense. The boy shuffled away, sniffling quietly. Grayson turned back to his work. He couldn't afford to be distracted, not when he was so close to achieving his goal. The next day, Grayson met with Frank Donovan, the private investigator who had first uncovered Kayla and Asher's affair. A USB drive across the table. Financial records linking your wife and brother to a major drug cartel. It's all the dates, transactions, the works. Grayson's eyes widened. This was exactly what he needed to push things over the edge. How did you get this? Frank smirked. You don't want to know. Let's just say I have friends. As Grayson left the meeting, he was thinking about all the possibilities this new evidence could bring. He was sure that, combined with what he'd already fabricated, it would be the final nail in Kayla and Asher's coffin that night. Grayson was ready to upload the falsified records to an anonymous server, where they'd be discovered by law enforcement. Grayson heard a commotion downstairs and went to investigate. He found Maya and Finn in the kitchen, huddled over Maya's phone. What's going on? He demanded. Maya looked up, her eyes shining with hope. Someone posted bail for Mom and Uncle Asher. They're being released. Have posted bail. He needed them behind bars, vulnerable and isolated. That's great news. He managed to choke it out, but remember, they're still facing serious charges. Nothing's been proven yet. As the kids chattered excitedly about seeing Kayla and Asher again, Grayson retreated to his office, his mind whirling. He needed to act fast to make sure this setback didn't derail everything he'd worked for. He picked up his phone and dialed Carol's number. We've got a problem, he said as soon as she answered. They're out on bail. We need to move up our timeline. Caroline's voice was tense. That's risky, she said. If we push too hard now, it might backfire. I don't care, Grayson said. I want them back behind bars where they belong. Whatever it takes. There was a long pause before Caroline responded. All right, I'll make some calls, but Grayson, are you sure about this? There's no coming back from what we're about to do. Grayson's voice was cold and determined. They destroyed my life. Now I'm going to destroy theirs. As he hung up, Grayson heard the front door open. Kayla's voice, then Asher's, floated up the stairs, followed by the excited cries of Maya and Finn. His jaw clenched as he listened to the joyful reunion happening below. Let them have their moment, he thought. It would make their fall all the more devastating. Grayson took a deep breath, trying to steady himself for what was to come. Then he descended the stairs, ready to face the people who had betrayed him and set his final plan in motion. The living room fell silent as he entered. Kayla and Asher stood frozen, their arms. The fear in the eyes of the children was evident as they met Grayson's gaze. Welcome home, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. I hope you enjoyed your little vacation behind bars because trust me, it's about to become a permanent arrangement. Kayla stepped forward, her hands outstretched, pleadingly. Gray, let's talk. There's a lot we need to explain. Save it. Grayson interrupted her coldly. I'm not listening to your excuses. You had a chance to come clean, and you chose to betray me. Asher moved to stand beside Kayla. His face showed regret. We never meant to hurt you. Things just got out of control. Grayson's laugh was harsh and bitter. Out of order, Maya? Is this how you think I feel about sleeping with your wife for years, passing off your children as mine, planning to steal everything I've worked for? Maya's voice was small and confused as she tried to break the tension. Dad, what are you talking about? For a moment, Grayson hesitated. The kids didn't deserve to be caught up in this ugly situation. Then he remembered the conversation he'd overheard, how Maya had been involved in the scheme. He told her, You want to know the truth, Maya? Your mother and uncle have been lying to us for years. They're not the people we thought they were. Kayla made a strangled sound of protest. Gray wasn't in front of the kids, but Grayson was beyond caring. The dam had broken, and all the pain and rage he'd been holding back came flooding out. You want to know why they were really in jail? He continued, his eyes never leaving Kayla. And Asher's face was a picture. Fraud, money laundering, tax evasion, that's just the start of it. They'd been plotting for years to take everything from me, our home, our savings, everything. Finn burst into tears, burying his face in Asher's leg. Maya stood frozen, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. That's not true, she cried. Tell him it's not true. But Kayla and Asher remained silent, their guilt written plainly across their faces. Grayson felt a twisted sense of satisfaction at their obvious distress. Oh, it gets better, he said, his voice low and dangerous. You want to know who your real father is? Kids, take a good look at your Uncle Asher. The silence that followed was deafening. Maya stumbled backward, shaking her head in denial. Finn's sobs grew louder. You bastard! Asher finally spat, his face contorted with rage. How dare you do this to them? Grayson's smile was cold and mirthless. How dare I? That's rich, coming from you. You're the ones who've... I've been living a lie all these years. I'm just finally telling the truth. He turned to the children, his voice softening a little. I'm sorry you had to find out this way, but it's time you knew who your parents really are. With that, he strode past the shocked and devastated group, heading for the front door. For the handle, Kayla stopped him. Where are you going? She asked. Her voice trembled. I'm going to finish what I started, Grayson replied. By the time I'm done, you'll wish you never even thought about betraying me. He slammed the door behind him. Inside, Grayson felt a mix of emotions churning. He felt guilty for the pain he just caused the children, but he was consumed by rage and the desire for revenge, and he felt only grim satisfaction. He climbed into his car, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped the steering wheel. There was no turning back now. The final phase of his plan was about to kick off, and when it was over, Kayla and Asher would lose everything, just as they tried to take everything from him. As he drove away from the house, he left behind the shattered remains of what he'd once thought was his family. Grayson's resolve hardened. He would see this through to the bitter end. Grayson knew he had to end this, no matter the cost. The courthouse loomed before him, its stone facade a monument to justice. He tied his tie, a grim smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Today, justice would be served, but on his terms. As he climbed the steps, a familiar voice called out behind him. Gray? He turned to see. Kayla was hurrying towards him, her face drawn and pale. Asher trailed behind her, looking equally haggard. What do you want? Grayson demanded. Please, can we talk before things go any further? Kayla pleaded. There's nothing to talk about. You made your choices. Grayson replied coldly. Now you have to live with them. Asher stepped forward, his jaw clenched. You don't have to do this, brother. We can still work something out. Grayson's laugh was harsh and bitter. Work something out like you two worked out how to steal my life from me? I don't think so. Grayson left them standing on the steps inside the courtroom, which was buzzing with tension. He took his seat behind the prosecution and nodded curtly to Caroline. She leaned in and said in a low voice, Are you ready for this? Once we present this evidence, there's no going back. Grayson's eyes were hard, and he replied, I've never been more. Asher and Kayla were ready for anything. Grayson felt a surge of dark satisfaction. They looked broken, defeated, and he was glad they were finally feeling some of the pain they caused him. The judge entered and the room fell silent. We're here today to continue the case of the state versus Cabe Parker. Asher Parker said, I understand the prosecution has new evidence to present. Caroline stood her ground, looking confident. Yes, Your Honor, we've uncovered a web of criminal activity that's far more extensive than we first thought. She began to lay out the case, presenting the mountain of evidence that Grayson had meticulously fabricated. It showed millions in suspicious transfers, emails linking Kayla and Asher to known criminal enterprises, offshore accounts, shell companies. All of this painted a damning picture of large-scale financial crimes. Grayson watched as the color drained from Kayla and Asher's faces. Their lawyer, a wheezy little man named Simmons, was on his feet constantly objecting to nearly every piece of evidence. A man named Simmons was constantly objecting to the evidence, Your Honor. This is ridiculous, Simmons said. My clients are guilty of nothing more than trying to secure their financial future. These wild accusations of criminal empires and money laundering are. The judge gave Simmons a stern look. The evidence speaks for itself, he said. Your objection is overruled. As the day wore on, Grayson could see the hope fading from Kayla and Asher's eyes. They whispered furiously with their lawyer during every break. Their gestures became increasingly frantic during one recess. Asher approached Grayson in the hallway. Gray, please, he said, his voice low. You know this isn't true. We never did any of these things. They're accusing us of. You change your story when it's convenient for you. Asher's face crumpled. We made a terrible mistake, he said. I know that, but this will destroy us. Think of the kids, Gray. Please, for a moment. Grayson felt a flicker of doubt about the kids, but then he remembered the overheard conversation, the years of lies and betrayal. His resolve hardened. You should have thought about that before you betrayed me. Now you'll see everything you tried to take from me slip through your fingers. He turned and walked away, leaving Asher standing alone in the hallway as the trial resumed. Caroline called her star witness, Frank Donovan, the private investigator, took the stand. His weathered face was impassive as he recounted discovering Kayla and Asher's affair. In the course of your investigation, Mr. Donovan, what else did you uncover? Caroline asked. Frank's voice was steady as he detailed the web of financial crimes he discovered. Frank was really good at acting. Every word was a lie, but he delivered it with total conviction. Simmons was on his feet again, his face red with frustration. He said, Your Honor, this is nothing but hearsay and conjecture. The judge was clearly getting tired of this. Mr. Simmons, you need to have concrete evidence to refute these claims. To refute these claims, I suggest you sit down. Frank stepped down from the stand. Grayson caught Kayla's eye. The look of betrayal and confusion on her face was almost comical. Did she really think he would just roll over and let them destroy him? The final blow came when Caroline presented the falsified records. Linking Kayla and Asher to a major drug cartel, the courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. The judge ordered, banging his gavel. I've heard enough. We'll reconvene tomorrow for closing arguments and sentencing. As the court was dismissed, Grayson watched Kayla and Asher being led away in handcuffs. He was filled with a grim satisfaction. He sat alone in his empty house, his phone buzzing with a text from Maya. Dad, please can we talk? I don't understand what's happening. He stared at the message for a long moment before deleting it. There was nothing left to say. The next morning Grayson arrived at the courthouse early. He found Caroline pacing in the hallway, her face tense. Grayson, she said, her voice low and urgent. We need to talk. I've been doing some digging, and some of this evidence doesn't add up. Are you sure everything you gave me was legitimate? For a moment, panic flared in Grayson's house, but he quickly composed himself. His face was a study in innocent confusion. What are you talking about? Of course it's legitimate. Are you saying you don't trust me? Caroline studied him for a long moment, her eyes narrowing. I'm saying that if any of this turns out to be fabricated, we're both in very deep trouble. Grayson met her gaze steadily. It's all true, Caroline. Every bit of it. Now, are you ready to finish this? She nodded slowly, still looking uncertain. But as they entered the courtroom, her professional mask slipped back into place. The closing arguments were a formality. The mountain of evidence against Kayla and Asher. It was a lot to take in. Simmons tried to paint them as misguided but essentially good people who had made a terrible mistake. But Grayson could see from the jury's faces that they weren't buying it. When it came time for sentencing, the judge's voice was grave. Cabe Parker and Asher Parker, please rise. They stood. Kayla was visibly shaken, and Asher was trembling. The crimes you have been found guilty of are extensive and severe. Not only did you betray the trust of your family, but you engaged in a pattern of criminal behavior that undermines the very fabric of our society. Grayson leaned forward, his heart pounding. This was it, the moment he'd been waiting for. He sentenced them both to 20 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for at least 15 years. The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. Kayla let out a strangled sob, collapsing against Asher. He stood rigid, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. They were led away, with Kayla's anguished cries echoing through the courtroom. Grayson felt a range of emotions, including relief and satisfaction, as well as a sense of emptiness he hadn't expected. Outside the courthouse, reporters approached him. Mr. Parker, what are your thoughts on the verdict? Did you have any idea? What are you going to do now, Grayson, about the extent of your wife and brother's crimes? He pushed past them, ignoring their questions. He climbed into his car and drove home, his mind a whirl of conflicting thoughts. The house was quiet when he arrived. It seemed eerily so he wandered from room to room, surrounded by memories of the life he'd once had. The family photos on the wall seemed to mock him now, reminders of the lies he'd lived for so long. In the kitchen, he found a note from Maya. It said, "Dad, we got to stay with Grandma? I don't. I know you're hurting, but I understand what's happening. When you're ready to talk, we'll be here." They weren't his kids, and they never had been. It was better this way. As night fell, he found himself in his home office, staring at the computer where he'd orchestrated Kayla and Asher's downfall with a few keystrokes. He could erase all traces of his deception, but something stopped him. Instead, he opened a drawer and pulled out an old photo album. Inside were pictures of. He thought back to happier times, his wedding day, the birth of the children he thought were his family, and happy holidays. For a moment, he allowed himself to remember the love and joy these moments had brought him. But then the bitterness came back, poisoning the memories with sudden violence. He flung the album across the room, and it hit the wall with a satisfying thud. Pages scattered across the floor. Grayson stood there, breathing heavily, and walked to the fireplace to gather the fallen photos. One by one, he tossed them into the flames, watching as the faces of his former family curled and blackened as the last photo burned away. Grayson felt a sense of finality settle over him. It was done. He had won. Kayla and Asher would spend years behind bars, their reputations destroyed, their futures in ruins. But as he stared into the dying embers, Grayson realized the victory felt hollow. He had destroyed the people who had betrayed him, yes, but in doing so, he had also destroyed any chance of ever truly moving on. Grayson was alone now, cut off from everyone he had once loved. The house around him, once filled with the sounds of family life, was silent and empty. Grayson poured himself a drink, raising the glass in a mocking toast to the ashes in the fireplace and justice. He muttered bitterly as he sipped his whiskey. Grayson's phone was ringing. It was a text from Caroline. "It's done. All traces of our involvement have been erased. I hope it was worth it." Grayson didn't bother responding. Instead, he walked to the window and stared out. Beyond the neighborhood, darkness settled. Families were tucked safely in their homes, blissfully unaware of the betrayals and lies that could be lurking just beneath the surface. Grayson's reflection stared back at him from the glass. For a moment, he barely recognized himself. The man he had been trusted with, loved and devoted to his family was gone. In his place stood someone harder, colder. Someone who had been willing to destroy everything to get his revenge. He turned away from the window, his gaze tomorrow. He'd take down the family photos that had once hung on the walls. He'd erase every trace of Kayla Asher and the children from the house. It'd be a fresh start, a clean slate. But as Grayson climbed the stairs to his empty bedroom, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd lost far more than he'd gained. The house was his asset, secure, but the cost had been higher than he'd ever imagined. He lay down on the bed and stared up at the ceiling. The silence of the house pressed in. As he slept, the house was a constant reminder of everything he had lost and everything he had destroyed. His last thought was of the family he had once loved. Despite everything, a small part of him still mourned. But it was too late for regrets. The revenge was complete. All that was left was to live with the consequences of his choices in the darkness of the empty house. Grayson Parker slept alone, victorious in his vengeance, but utterly alone.